Shalom Aleichem. Welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, The Firschein Press, A Legacy Preserved, with Ben Firschein and Shelley Hebert, with moderator Caleb Scheer. Before we get started, a few of the usual housekeeping notes. Your audio and your video will be turned off throughout the program. You may send us your questions via the question panel at the lower right of your screen. We ask that you keep comments off of your questions and keep questions short so that we can try to get to all of the questions after this evening's program. I want to welcome several people who will be on with us this evening. By way of introductions, Caleb Scheer, who is moderating this evening's program, was the Yiddish Book Center's 2023 to 2025 Richard S. Herman Fellow. An aspect of his fellowship work included researching and facilitating bringing the Firschein Press to the center. Ben Firschein, family grandson, will be sharing the family story. Regrettably, Ben's brother, who we hoped would be able to be here, has a scheduling conflict, basically. Joseph was unable to join us this evening, but we thank him for all of his contributions. Shelley Hebert will join us later in the program to share about her relationship with the family and how she worked so diligently to connect the family and the Yiddish Book Center, and ultimately to help bring the Firschein Press and materials to be included in the Yiddish Book Center's collection. I'll now pass the mic to my former colleague fellow, Caleb Scheer, and he will now share the story for you. Thanks. Welcome, Caleb.
Thank you, Lisa, for that kind introduction. I just want to start by saying it's an absolute honor to be back here on the Yiddish Book Center's virtual stage and to be sharing it tonight with Ben and Shelley, and to share a bit about the story of the Firschein Press, which is just a wonderful story, and I'm very excited to get into it. So let me start by sharing my screen here. Very good. Okay. So I'm going to start a little timer for myself to make sure that I don't go on too long so we can hear from our other presenters tonight. But I've been asked here tonight to give you guys a little bit of context about what the Firschein Press collection is, how it fits into the Book Center's existing collection of print and type materials, and what we are very excited about going forward into the future now that the press has found its home at the Yiddish Book Center. So to begin with a little bit of context, the collection we're talking about tonight is the Yiddish Book Center's collection of type and print materials, specifically letterpress print materials, which is a historic form of printing, really the dominant form of printing for several hundred years, from Gutenberg's invention of movable type really up until the 1970s. And this was true for, Latin scripts, English, French, German, other languages like that, as much as it was also true for Hebrew script languages, such as Hebrew or Yiddish. So the Yiddish Book Center's collection is, we believe today, the largest, if not among the largest, collections of extant Hebrew and Yiddish hand-set letterpress type in the world, and that includes both wood type and metal type. So as you can see here on this slide, we've got an image of some of our type cabinets, as they're called. That's the lingo. And each of those drawers, or cases, as we call them in printers lingo, is filled with all sorts of metal and wood type in the Hebrew or Yiddish script. So the Book Center has over 127 cases or drawers full of this type, and that's before we even get to the Firschein type collection's addition to those 127 drawers. So I'm going to give you a quick word about the provenance of the collection. So about half of the collection comes from the Forwards, the Jewish Daily Forward, and its former print shop in New York City. About another half of the collection comes from a gentleman named Jim Kaplan, who was a longtime hobbyist printer and also one of our very first volunteer book sammlers when the Book Center got its operations up and going in the 1980s. And now, of course, we are incredibly honored to also be home to the Firschein Press collection as well, on top of that. So I'm going to forward a slide. So as I mentioned, the Firschein Press collection added an additional 12 cases or drawers full of type to our collection, full of lots, as you can see in the bottom left corner there, of rare and incredibly well-preserved Hebrew wood type. Which is something that, is such a valuable addition to the center's collection, because to really get historic Yiddish wood type, like the Firschein collection and the Firschein family have preserved for all these years, is just an unbelievably rare occurrence. I really cannot stress enough just how unusual it is to have such a well-preserved collection and how honored we are at the center to be a home to that collection now. So in addition to that, there were also several boxes full of what we call cuts, plates, images, and other printing equipment amongst the Firschein collection, and also, as we'll see on the next slide in just a minute, an old printing press as well. So before we get to the printing press, one of the things I did just want to mention about what makes the Firschein collection so special at the center is that it represents a very different part of the historic printing trade and the historic Yiddish printing trade. So as I mentioned, part of the center's collection comes from the Vorwärts, the great Yiddish newspaper out of New York City, which really represents sort of, the grand industrial scale of Yiddish printing. I mean, some folks may know at the peak of its circulation, the Vorwärts newspaper circulated over 175,000 copies daily. They had a massive printing operation. It was really industrialized. And then Jim Kaplan's contribution to the Yiddish Book Center's type collection actually comes from a gentleman named Henry Einspruch, or Chaim Einspruch, whose story I will skip today because it's a fascinating story in its own right, but we don't have time to do it justice now. But he was sort of a self-publishing kind of figure. So then you have, on the one hand, the industrial, on the other hand, the very personal and artisanal. And the Firschein collection represents really the missing piece of the historic printing trade, like I said. So the Firschein family's press was what we in the industry call a jobbing press, which is basically just a fancy way of saying that they were a community-based printing press operation which specialized in producing what we generally think of as stationery. So things like business cards, wedding invitations, bar and bat mitzvah invitations, business stationery, all sorts of stuff like that. And as Ben will show you later, I believe, the Firschein Press is also noted for having an absolutely incredible archive of what we call show cards, or really posters, advertising for businesses, events in the community, lots of beautiful examples of posters advertising, for example, cantors coming to sing at particular synagogues in Brooklyn back in the day. And so it really is that, missing piece that really makes the center's collection now, I would argue, one of the most incredible collections of historic Yiddish language printing materials anywhere in the world. So with that brief context, I'm going to hand things over now to Ben Firschein to tell you a little bit more about the family and the history of the Firschein Press. Oh, before I do that, sorry, I did just want to, sorry, Ben, to show folks very quickly here the press itself in location at the center, which, as you can see, is a massive hulking machine. It weighs over 1,000 pounds. It's made of solid cast iron. And now I will hand things over to Ben to tell you a little bit more about the history of this wonderful machine and the press at large.
Thank you, Caleb. Next slide, please. Okay, so good evening, everybody. My name is Ben Firschein. I'm one of two brothers, Firschein. My brother Joseph, unfortunately, as was mentioned, had a scheduling conflict this evening, but he sends his regards. And I also want to give a shout out to Shelley, who's on the presentation this evening, because none of this would have happened without Shelley, for sure. I mean, she worked for like 5+ years to, she knows everybody, and she just made it happen, and we're so appreciative for that. And of course, our parents, Oscar and Theda Firschein, who unfortunately passed away this year, they also made it happen. So, Joseph and I are, we grew up with the press in our home. You'll see momentarily that we got to see it when we were kids, and we went to New York City to see our grandparents. So it's very much part of Joseph and my lived experience and family history too. But this story very much starts with Shelley and Oscar and Theda Firschein, our parents. And so I just want to mention that the press is very much, and the collection is very much a living connection to the past, and also a path to the future. And so what I'd encourage is, when we're going through the slides here, you're going to see some family pictures, and I just want you to encourage you to think about this, as been said, as a family business, as a small business, as a livelihood. There's some craziness, as you'll see. I can tell you a couple quick funny stories if I have a chance. But there's the past, and then the future is that it now sits in this very wonderful facility at the Yiddish Book Center in this collection, and it's going to be used by all sorts of folks, scholars and other people, students and other people who get to come to the center and see it. And it's a working press, and that's just phenomenal. So next slide, please. So these photos here come courtesy of Larry Shapiro by way of Shelley, and you can see they're absolutely beautiful photos. You can see again the printing press, and you can see the type. And just to kind of like put like the man behind the curtain here, this press sat in what Grandma Ruth Firschein lived in. We called it the grandma room when she lived with us for about 5 years. And a lot of times it had a coat draped over it, or it had some other piece of family schmutz draped over it. Here it is in all its photographic glory, but the live experience, the true experience is it was part of our family, and it wasn't always this glamorous, but here it is. The next slide, please. And again, you can see the wonderful type, and you can see some of the posters here, and you can see a frame where type is set here. So with that, we'll move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit of history. This all starts in 1910. A family business was born, and next slide, please. So you can see it would basically be my great-grandfather, Joseph Firschein, and then you have Harry, who's my grandfather, and Oscar, my father, as a little boy. They're all standing in front of Firschein Press. It was opened by Joseph in 1910. He was an immigrant from Ukraine, and he opened it with his sons, Harry and Izzy. And Harry and Izzy actually ran it together briefly until Harry ran it alone. But I want to emphasize the printing press is the internet of its time for the small community. And so these posters, has been said, they advertised synagogues, boxing matches, songs, dance, singles events. I mean, it's funny, back then they were all doing this. But Joseph passed away in 1958, and Harry eventually took over the business. Next slide, please. So you can see one of the posters that was printed on the press, printing that pleases particular people. We like this because you can see the smudge and the pea. I guess depends on how particular you want to be or not. But I mean, this is a homegrown business, and they did their best for many years, and they served a lot of different customers. Next slide, please. You can see some of the absolutely beautiful posters that they printed up. And again, this is part of the community. Next slide. So here is Grandpa Harry and Grandma Ruth. They're in front of the printing press. I'm sorry, the Firschein press with the printing presses inside. And next slide, please. Here they are together. They worked next to each other, side by side, shoulder by shoulder, and this was how they supported three kids. My father Oscar, his brother Bill, and their sister Nikki. They supported three kids with this business. Next slide, please. Okay, so we got to visit in 1973, and I just want to show you the absolute craziness going on here. You can see you've got, Grandma Ruth's on the phone. She's screaming at somebody. There's probably like a customer order coming in. You have Grandpa Harry here, and you have somebody, probably a customer, who's in the door frame there. And then this little one here you see with the glasses, that's me in 1973. And I just want to, I told you I'd tell you a story, a very quick one, to show you what a family business it was and how it sometimes was on the verge of precariousness. So as I mentioned, Harry and his brother operated together for a while, and they decided at some point that they should give themselves a raise, but they couldn't really afford to give themselves a raise. So when they wrote themselves checks for the raise, they agreed that they were going to keep the checks in a drawer in the printing press, in their store, and not cash the checks because they couldn't really afford to cash the checks, but they were going to give themselves a raise anyway. They just weren't going to cash the checks for the raise. So next slide, please. You can see Grandpa Harry diligently working here. You can see this is where the type goes, and it goes ultimately into the thing that they set it in. Next slide, please. You can see again the frame and the lead type. Next slide. You can see the wheel, and you can see, again, this is how they did it. Next slide. Joseph and I are having an opportunity to see the whole thing. Next slide. Grandpa is showing Joseph how it all works. Next slide. You can see Joseph and Ben. Next slide. And we got to actually print things off. I think I was all of 8 years old. Joseph was maybe 6. And these printing presses are humongous, and they don't have a lot of safeguards on them. I mean, maybe at the Yiddish Book Center they will, but the idea of, this massive flywheel and this massive plate that's going back and forth with the type, and Joseph and I actually set some type and printed off some posters, and this is considered to be perfectly acceptable back then. I don't know if I'd let my kid, do it, but that's what they let us do. Next slide, please. So again, you can see this massive plate. Keep going, please. Joseph, next slide, please. Grandma and Joseph, next slide, please. Joseph again. You can see the elbow grease you need on this. Next slide, please. And there they are in front of the print shop. Next slide. Okay, and so Grandpa Harry actually printed up my bar mitzvah invitations on the printing press. So you can see that, makes an indentation. It's very pretty, and it's not like going to Kinko's or, wherever it's not like using like your laser printer and modern stuff. They actually competed with with linotype, and they competed with the Kinko's of the world. They competed with lots of people, and they managed to stay in business and have good run. And as you can see, they made a beautiful bar mitzvah invitation for me when I was bar mitzvah. Next slide, please. Okay, I also want to show you the printing press's family narrative. Next slide, please. So my mother, Theda, who unfortunately, like my father, passed on this year, was a writer, and we put together a book of her short stories. And the printing press features very prominently in a number of these stories. And so I won't read this whole thing here, but this is about how Harry actually printed up their wedding invitations, my mom and my dad's wedding invitations. And so this is a little bit of literature here, which is nice because the Yiddish Book Center is about books, about how Harry worked very carefully to put the invitations together and print them off. And so this reality became a work of fiction in a number of stories that my mother wrote. And so that's quite nice. Next slide, please. So Harry died in 1979, and my father went back to close up the print shop, and he decided he was going to bring one of the printing presses, the one that's now in the Yiddish Book Center, across the country to Menlo Park, California, where we had our family home, where it resided all the way until very recently when it made its way to the Yiddish Book Center. Next slide, please. So you'll see this image here. My father is the one wearing the glasses. He's over by this gate here. You can see there are these two big burly guys who are manhandling this thing up plywood ramps to get it into the room that it resided in for many, many years. That was the room that my grandma Ruth lived in. So there's a very nice set of full circle here where it was in their family business, and then it ended up in the room where she lived for a number of years with our family. And I'm going to give you now, as Caleb advances the slide, the voice of my father, who describes a little bit about how the printing press made its way to Menlo Park, California. Next slide.
We closed down the shop, and we had them pack up in a crate the 1-ton printing press, and it went on its way. Now, this is not a speedy way of traveling, you should understand. So I had almost forgotten about this incident when finally I got a call, and it was from the Redwood City train station, of all places, the freight station. And it seems like our printing press had shown up finally after many, many months of travel around this beautiful United States. Wonderful, I said. I told him where we lived. He said fine. He had a truck, a big truck, and he would come down to Stowe Lane and deliver the printing press.
So there's actually more to the story. My father was a writer also. He was a computer scientist and engineer, but he actually wrote two memoirs towards the end of his life. And he's actually got one of the stories in his memoir about how that story continues. And suffice it to say that there were many, many twists and turns from the rail station in our neighborhood to the printing press sitting in in the home. It involved a forklift operator, involved safe movers. It was quite an enterprise, but they got it ultimately into the house where it sat for many years. Next slide, please. Again, you can see they're manhandling this thing. That's the driveway of our home, and it had to come down this windy road, which is where the forklift came into play. Next slide, please. Well, this is the neighborhood kids. I think that the blonde kid is probably Joseph. I'm not sure who the other blonde kid is on to the left of the slide. But the kids were utterly fascinated with it. It sat outside the house until they figured out how to manhandle it into the room, and the kids played with it again. I don't know that I let my kid play with a 1,000-pound printing press, but we did, and we had a lot of fun looking at it. Next slide, please. Okay, so before the printing press made its way to the Yiddish Book Center, Shelley, who knew my parents quite well, was in my parents' home and noticed all these posters that they had, and managed ultimately through, again, a lot of diligent hard work and connections, contacts, to forge a arrangement with a long time relationship with the Magnus Center at Berkeley, they were quite interested in these posters. As you can see, they created an exhibition of these printing press posters from my grandfather's printing press, and that's a permanent collection now at the Magnus. And as you can see, it very much was the internet of the time, and they've had graduate students who've been doing essentially like sociological and anthropological research, reconstructing what that Yiddish immigrant neighborhood is like based on the posters. Next slide, please. So you can see this kind of ratty room that it lived in for many, many years. We called it the grandma room. This is where Grandma Ruth, well, first Grandpa Harry and Grandma Ruth lived, and then Grandma Ruth lived on her own. And you can see the printing press there, a little bit less glamorous than it looks in some of the more high glamour shots. But this is where it lived from, I don't know, about like 30, 40 years. That's where it lived until it came to the Yiddish Book Center. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll just close with this. The future, a living press learning for the next generation. As you can see, this printing press has had a long life, many twists and turns. Hopefully it'll continue to have a long life. And through the generosity of Shelley and her husband and the Yiddish Book Center and other folks, it lives on. And it's our hope to see it continue to do that. Joseph and I look forward to going to Yiddish Book Center and looking at it and seeing everybody using it. But again, we're deeply appreciative to everybody, and I know my parents would say that if they were still alive. With that, I'm just going to close and thank everybody, and we'll now open the panel up to everybody.
Thank you, Ben, and we do hope you'll come to the center, but I guess we have to print you a real invitation on the press.
Yeah, on the printing press, that'd be great.
All right. We wanted to invite you, Shelley, to come on with us. And I thought I would get started with one quick question, which is, Shelley, could you take a little time and tell us what drew you to all of this and how you got involved and made this marriage between the Firschein Press and the Yiddish Book Center?
Thank you so much. It's such a wonderful moment to have reached this. It really is a journey that began about 10 years ago for me. I first met Oscar and Theda Firschein in a Talmud study class and got to know them a little bit there. And at the time, I was on the board of Hillel at Stanford, and I was very interested in doing my own research about Stanford's Jewish history. And I had been given a book based on a talk that Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel had given at Stanford in the 1960s. And I happened to mention this one day at Talmud class, and Oscar and Theta said, "Oh, we were there." So, really? You heard Abraham Joshua Heschel speak at Stanford? And that led me to discover that there was actually a recording, an old reel-to-reel tape recording of Heschel's talk, and I got that digitized and arranged with Oscar and Theta that I would come to their house in order to play this talk that they had heard in person. But when I got to the house, they said, "Oh, would you like to see our posters?" And of course, I was curious. And the first thing they did was open this cabinet, which had well over 100 first edition, pristine condition posters from the Firschein press. So that was my first glimmer of what was happening there. And then they said, "Well, we actually have the printing press too. Would you like to see that?" So they opened the door to this wonderland that Ben has been describing. And I I was speechless because not only did they have the printing press, but then of course they had the cabinets with this absolutely beautiful wooden type. And then over time and over subsequent visits, I discovered not only do they have the printing press and the type, but they actually had the original client records from all these Jewish community organizations in Brooklyn with the little handwritten index cards and amazing other items from the Jewish community of early 20th century Brooklyn. And so the idea that all of this might someday end up in a dumpster was just unbearable to me. And it really was love at first sight. So it was a great adventure and a great privilege to help these precious things find a good home.
And I wonder also, before we open it up to our questions, Caleb, I'd love to ask you a quick question, which is, a lot went in after Shelley contacted us about this. And I know you worked with bibliographer and our chief curator, David Mazauer, who you worked with as a bibliography fellow for many years. And there was a lot of research in this, and it was very exciting to find out the history of this and the importance of the collection. Can you speak a little bit about that and what solidified this relationship?
For sure, yeah. So I guess I'll start by just sort of maybe giving another piece of background that I didn't give earlier, which is, how I sort of got involved with the letterpress materials at the center to begin with, which is actually somewhat coincidental. I mean, it just so happened that in my second year at the fellowship at the book center, there was a conference happening later that year in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on the history of Hebrew and Yiddish language typography and printing. And so the organizer of that conference happened to know that the book center had this wonderful collection and wanted someone from the center to come and talk about the book center's collection a little bit. And so, Lisa, as you mentioned, David Mazauer, our research bibliographer and my former boss at the center, asked me if it would be something I would be interested in doing. And I said, sure. At that point, knowing next to nothing about the history of printing, about letterpress printing, about typography, about all of that kind of stuff. And so I kind of threw myself into it. And quickly sort of taught myself and learned a little bit about this history and learned about the center's collection and went off to present at this conference, fell in love with the whole art form, came back, and the next day, very next day, I bought myself my own printing press on eBay, and that currently sits in my apartment now here in Toronto. But so, you know, it was sort of, I say that to really emphasize just how wonderfully coincidental it was that, you know, not very long after that, Shelley got in touch with us at the book center and said, I want to make a shidduch basically between the Firschein family and the Yiddish Book Center to find a home for this press and this type. And, which was just, you know, the timing was absolutely perfect because it just so happened that I had just started to sort of teach myself about this materials and felt like I was in a position where I could really advocate for why this material history was so important. Um, and so I was, you know, very fortunate to be able to do that and to get the support of the administration of the book center to engage in a kind of crazy project, if we're honest about it, to bring this press over. The way you know, for a while I was telling people when I was showing them the press in the vault downstairs at the Yiddish Book Center was that the press had made its way to us from Brooklyn by way of California, which is just, you know, kind of a crazy thing to do. Ben, I think you can maybe confirm or deny this, but I had heard from Shelley, and I think this came by way of Oscar, that, you know, in the late 70s or 80s, when the press was being moved first from Brooklyn to Menlo Park, that it was basically, you know, it was as simple as, you know, finding a freight operator on a train line and paying them the equivalent of a couple $100s to put the press on the train and bring it over to California. Now, of course, it's never as simple as it sounds, and as you say, there was all sorts of twists and turns in the story of how the press got from the train depot to your house in California. But let me say, it's not quite so easy these days to put something on a train and bring across country, especially a 1,000 pound printing press. So it took a lot of administration and organization and logistics to try and get the press back from California to the East Coast. But eventually we did manage to do it. And I'll just sort of conclude this by saying that, you know, there were as many twists and turns in getting the press literally off the truck and into the center as I imagine there were getting it off the truck and into your house in California. At one point, we had one pallet jack that's, you know, ours at the book center, and we were trying to, the press was in this big crate and it was all packed up nicely so that nothing would move around and everything was nice and secure. And so we slid our pallet jack under the big crate and we start to try and jack it up and get the press moving. And this thing is just too heavy. Like there's no way that our pallet jack is going to be able to lift it on its own. So eventually the truck driver very kindly offered, well, I've also got a pallet jack in my truck. And so we eventually had to jerry rig it with, you know, our pallet jack on the front and his pallet jack on the back and two people jacking it up and pushing it and pulling it at the same time. And slowly but surely, inch by inch, we got it, you know, up onto our loading dock and through the doors and then down into our elevator and into the vault. So, um, needless to say, these things are not easy to move around. And I think we're very grateful that it's now found, hopefully, a somewhat permanent home at the Yiddish Book Center and that it'll be able to live out a long life there in its new home now.
Which makes me want to ask you, Ben, having grown up with this is such a part of your family. If I may, things like that, or at least they were aspects like this, to me, were like family members. So it must be really quite amazing for you to talk about the history of it, but also to know that through Shelley, this has really found a home, which would, I imagine, make your family very happy.
Right. Yeah. And so, I mean, all this add, I mean, you know, as I said, both parents passed on this year. Joseph and I are the co-trustees of the family trust now, and we are working, you know, to make sure many things get a home, right? And so it's so eternally grateful to Shelley and the Yiddish Book Center and the Magnus also at Berkeley for being part of that dream. And you know, we're fine. We had an old Victrola, I think, that found a home with one of Shelley's friends, and we have Art also that we're working on trying to find a home for. It's a labor of love, right? And so the printing press, yeah, I mean, it was part of our childhood, and Joseph and I grew up playing around it, both when we went to New York many times, New York City, to visit the grandparents, and also in our own home that we grew up in. And so seeing this press have a permanent home now at the Yiddish Book Center is just, it's a dream come true, because as Shelley said, you know, you don't want to part with any of this. You don't want it to get dumpstered. It's a living part of history. my dad was almost 98 years old when he passed on, and my mom was somewhat younger, 93. But it's because they lived so long and because they kept this around for so long that we're now privileged to have this amazing history live on in various museum settings like the Yiddish Book Center. And so yeah, from being in our family home, a part of our childhood, part of our family history, to being now something very useful for people who visit the Yiddish Book Center and the Magnus, and scholars and other people who are going to use it to continue to tell that story and learn from it.
I'm gonna toss a few questions from the audience your way. I guess this one's for Ben. How did your family come to opening up a print shop? And was there some past history with that, or that just what they decided to do?
So I know a little bit of the family lore here. I'll try my best here. When my great grandfather came through, I believe it was Ellis Island, because that's where folks from Eastern Europe who came to New York City would go through. Uh, they asked him, as they asked other people, what their occupation was. And so my mother actually found a document where they'd written down what his occupation was, and it looked like composer, but we know that he wasn't a musician, right? We know he wasn't as a composer. So it actually was compositor, and a compositor is somebody who's a typesetter or a printer. So we believe that in his native Ukraine, that was his career, that was his profession. And so when they moved to Brooklyn from the old country, as they say, he set up shop in Brooklyn and ran it as a business. And as I say, it ended up with his kids. And then ultimately, Harry, my grandfather, took it over. It was him and his brother, then it was Harry. And so that's how they got the idea, because he was already doing it before they came to the United States. That's how.
Did the family continue to print in California, or did they move the press for sentimental reasons?
Well, they moved it for sentimental reasons. I'm just gonna. I think I noted this already. My father was a computer scientist and an engineer, and he actually knew folks that was somewhat involved himself in a lot of the computer revolution, including what ultimately became digital printing, right? Which you now do with like your MacBook Pro and your PC, and you have your home laser printer, or you have your inkjet, or whatever you have. And so my father is the bridge, one of the bridges from this very, very new technology that everybody has in their home to this old technology with the lead type. And so, and he grew up building crystal radios as a kid and making chemistry experiments with chemicals that you shouldn't be buying when you're 8 years old. But anyway, so he recognized that this was something that he wanted to bring to California for very sentimental reasons. And I think part of it is that, the family had printing and technology in the blood, right? I mean, my Uncle Bill, his brother, became an artist and did wood block print art. So no, we never actually ran anything off in our home. I suggested, like a smart aleck when I was older, we should print currency, but nobody liked that idea. So it just sat there in our home. We didn't print anything with it.
That's very good of you. Who made the letters? Were there any other workers in addition to family members?
Wait, when you say letters, what do you mean? I'm
I
sorry.
think they're talking about the type. So maybe the wood type. Yes, Caleb, there are some of it.
Yeah, I can jump in here. So most of the type, both the wood type and the metal type that would have been used by a print shop like the Firschein press would have actually been industrially produced. Even, Hebrew or Yiddish language or Yiddish script type in the United States was actually a pretty big industry. There were a number of what we call type foundries. So those are the people who, literally use the molten lead and they're pouring it into molds and they're producing the little metal letters. And then also the bigger type, the wood type. There are also a number of companies, some of which actually still exist in the United States, which actually produce this. There's one famous one out of Two Rivers, Wisconsin, called Hamilton Wood Type Company which is now mostly a sort of nonprofit museum organization, but back in the day was, probably the largest producer of wood type in the United States of America, and they did produce quite a wide range of Hebrew and Yiddish wood types. So I don't want to say that this stuff was dime a dozen back in the day, but it was an essential piece of equipment for the entire printing industry. And so, if there were books being printed, newspapers being printed, things like that being printed in Yiddish in the United States, which of course we know there were tons of, there would have been producers to produce this type, such that you could actually produce these materials.
I think that answers one of the questions. Did they print in Hebrew as well as Yiddish?
I mean, Ben, you can speak to that perhaps a little bit better than I can. I think I know from looking at some of the posters and other materials that the Firschein family produced and the press produced over the years is that, yeah, it was bilingual. In fact, one of the coolest things about the history of the Firschein press is that it's more than bilingual. It's trilingual, even quadrilingual, because you see if you look through the Magnus's archive online, you'll see posters in Hebrew, in Yiddish, in English, even in Spanish occasionally. I mean, it really was a cross section of just how multicultural, multi-ethnic that area of Brooklyn was in those days, and the sort of composition of those neighborhoods. So,
Question, did the Brooklyn print shop have a larger press? The posters look too big for the printing press you have.
Yes, they did. They had several humongous presses, and this was like the Shetland pony of the presses that my dad got across the country. And so, if a Shetland pony weighs 1,000 pounds, you can imagine what the other ones must have been like. They were behemoths.
Question, what do you know about how your grandmother's role was helping out with the printer? Was that unusual?
No, I mean, it was a family business, and my grandma Ruth was a very smart woman. I, I guess I shouldn't say this, but probably smarter than my grandpa Harry. I mean, she was a smart person. She actually came over to the United States at age 14, and she worked as a seamstress in a sweatshop and made garments, and she brought most of her family over. So she was very smart. And so my guess is that based on other photos that I have that I didn't put in the slide deck, that she probably handled like the back end, like the bookkeeping, the business stuff, probably some customer relations. And my grandfather was a taciturn man who didn't say much to anybody. And my guess is that he was mostly suited for setting the type, and they probably kept him away from the customers. And he was very talented at setting type and running off the posters, but she was more the sociable one who had the people skills. And I'm sure the business would not have been successful without her, for sure.
Shelley, it sounds like you invested a lot of time and energy into this. I'm wondering what it was about the press that captivated you and wanted you to find a home for it.
I think it's such a multi-dimensional, rich story that combines all in one graphic design, typography, printing technology, Jewish history, sociological culture, and a window into the past. So I think it was that whole package and that whole story that I saw represented in these objects that really fascinated me and caused me to also greatly admire Oscar and Theda. In addition to the printing press and the type, really their whole home was an incredible museum. It was filled from floor to ceiling and wall to wall with interesting objects and old books and things that Oscar, through his technology career, had accumulated. And Theda did say to me at one point that there was a time when she thought Oscar was a hoarder, but he was actually a collector. And she loved that, and we all had a good laugh.
Uh, Caleb, you mentioned using the press. Can you give any examples? Has it been used since it's arrived, and what are future plans for it?
Absolutely. The press has been lightly used since it's arrived at the center. As one of the photos that Ben showed at the beginning, one of Larry Shapiro's photos, the press, unsurprisingly, had accumulated several decades of dust and a bit of rust buildup on it, which is very usual, very typical for these old presses. I mean, one of the remarkable things about these machines is because they quite literally are built of solid cast iron. You really have to try to break these things. You know, they are incredibly hardy machines. So when the press arrived to us at the center, it needed a bit of cleanup, which we definitely did slowly over the course of a couple months. But it was really in functional order. I mean, it's you know, it's not like we were taking this thing apart and replacing all the nuts and bolts. I mean, this press is 110 years old, and it still works pretty much like the day that it would have been first used. It definitely needed a bit of oiling and things like that, of course, but that should be expected for any old machine. By the time I left the center at the end of August this year, the press was more or less in functional order. I had, you know, done a couple of tests on it, but yet to run through a full print run through it, which is something I'm hoping to be able to do to come back to the center at some point in the near future and do so. And really, what this press is great for, especially in the context of the Yiddish Book Center, is first of all, it enables us to work with the massive type collection that we've got in a much more concrete way than we've really been able to do in the past, not having access to an actual functional press like that on site. And then also is really has incredible value as a demonstration tool. I mean, this thing really, you know, it's very tactile, it's very visual. When you're operating it, you can really see how all the parts work, and so it's a brilliant teaching tool when it comes to the history of the Yiddish book and sort of Yiddish printed materials and how those things got created historically. Um, like Ben said, you know, you were talking a lot about how you were always astonished that the neighborhood kids got to play around with the machine in the 1970s. I will say I don't envision that the general public will be putting their hands on the press at the Yiddish Book Center anytime soon. Among printers and among letterpress printers today, these things are sometimes jokingly referred to as hand crushers. Because if you misplace your hand while the press is running and doing the wrong thing, you could lose a couple fingers pretty easily. But someone who is a skilled operator who knows what they're doing, it's perfectly safe. But you know, probably will be used in this case more for use by people who know what they're doing, visiting artists, visiting printers, things like that at the center, and then also for demonstration purposes to really, again, you know, bring this history alive and really be able to show people the inner workings and the behind the scenes of how Yiddish print and print in general historically operated.
And maybe this is the last question for you, Ben. What do you and Joseph hope for the press now that it's found this home?
Well, I mean, we're just so appreciative that it has found a home through the efforts of Shelley and Yiddish Book Center and Caleb and others. So kind of like what I've seen with the posters at the Magnus, again, through, you know, the efforts of Shelley and others, which is that we have a lot we have a lot we can learn still from this, you know, and so I was just amazed that, for example, at the Magnus, that graduate students were able to reconstruct the whole neighborhood based on these posters. I mean, like Caleb was saying, I mean, it's not just synagogues. I mean, it's like Spanish language posters about boxing matches. It's dances, and it's not just Jewish dances. I mean, it's the whole ethnic melange of the whole community there. And so uh, through this 110-year-old artifact, which at one point was not an artifact, I mean, it was part of a living, thriving, well, somewhat thriving family business. I hope that people will continue to learn about the community, that period in history, this type of technology. But equally important, because I mentioned there's the past and the present and the future, hopefully it'll contribute to people's knowledge of modern day type and modern day techniques and the computer typography. And like I say, my father was a computer scientist. He knew people like Donald Knuth at Stanford, who was one of the godfathers of digital typesetting. And hopefully someday maybe even people will digitally typeset the Yiddish type that sits in these wooden crates right now, right? I mean, that would be an amazing kind of ending of the story, right? If it was used in that really modern way. So I just, I hope people will continue to mine everything that this is and represents and use it far into the future. And I hope that people on the call today, people watching this will make their way to the Yiddish Book Center and see this as Joseph and I plan to do as well.
Well, thank you for that. I will also say, I think Caleb was nodding his head. My dream has been forever to digitize this and start using it graphically in our work. So we're with you on that, Ben. I want to thank each of you, Shelley for making the introduction, Ben and Joseph for getting us connected to get the press here, Caleb for the research that you put into it and the energy. I hope you all know on our end, there was a great buzz and a great excitement about this, and we are thrilled to have it. It's such an important piece. Thank you for joining us. Our best to Joseph. Again, I'm sorry, and I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that on this evening's program, you have some relatives. I guess I can say their names. Jenna and Joy are here, and Mary, they're coming in like crazy. Anyway, so to all of the Firschein family, hello, thank you, come visit. Again, Shelley, thank you. Huge thanks to you for your diligence and pluckiness getting this to happen. Yeah. And we hope you'll be at the center soon. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. And I want to thank our producer, as always, Elizabeth Carteropoli-Dearden, for all she does behind the scenes. Thanks to our members, all of you, and our donors who make all of our ongoing work possible. To learn more about how you can become a member and support our work, please visit yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. You can also check out our calendar of events. We have events coming up in cities across the country, as well as cities such as London. So check it out, some live events in your hometown, or come visit us at the center, or join us again in our virtual theater, yiddishbookcenter.org/events. Thanks again. I look forward to welcoming you back to our virtual theater or in person at the Yiddish Book Center. Until then, stay well, stay happy and healthy. Good night.